So after emu fields, they went back to Montebello Island, conducted 2 more tests, including one very large test, and then wanted a site on the mainland that was easier to access than Montebello Islands or emu fields, because it was a bit nearer centres of transport and communication. And so they got the government of Australia to agree to a site at what they called Maralinga. And then a whole series of tests and what were called minor trials were conducted there. And as I've said, the minor trials, although they weren't nuclear explosions, involved radioactive substances being dispersed by conventional explosives to see what would happen if there were accidents, and in the process contaminating large areas. And this is Sue Coleman Hazeldine, who is a very well-known Aboriginal activist, speaking about this period.
My name is Sue Coleman Hazeldine. I was born in 1951 on Caniba Mission. I was a small child when the British and Australian governments tested nuclear weapons in the South Australian desert near my birthplace. For over a decade, full nuclear explosions and hundreds of experiments dispersed plutonium and other weapons materials, contaminating almost all of Australia. Aboriginal people were still living close to the test sites and were told nothing about radiation. Some communities were so contaminated that most people developed acute radiation sickness. High rates of cancer were eventually documented in the 16,000 test workers, but no studies were done on Aboriginal people and others living in areas of fallout, many of whom were even more highly exposed. High rates of cancer and chronic illness haunt my family and our wider community. My small town of Sejuna is being called the cancer capital of Australia. I worry about animals and plants which are also harmed by radiation. They can't speak for themselves and are ignored and left to die. Today, the Australian and South Australian governments are again proposing nuclear waste dumps to South Australia, as if having been poisoned once, it's somehow okay for us and our lands to be radioactively sacrificed again. The language and rationale being used today is very similar to that of the 1950s. Desolate, unused lands, being used in the national interest. We won't accept this, not for us, not for the broader community. We know from bitter experience that nuclear materials and weapons can never be safe. Aboriginal people have the oldest living culture on the planet and have cared for these lands continuously. Despite attempts to annihilate, assimilate and suppress us, we remain committed to looking after our people, cultural knowledge, lands and waters.
Okay, so just the year before the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was negotiated, a group of Aboriginal women artists got together to create a new collection of artwork remembering the events at Maralinga. And I'm going to show you some of that artwork now with their permission. So this is the Maralinga banner, and you can see the vibrant, diverse wildlife in the foreground that is depicted, which is the life that's going to be lifted into the sky in the nuclear explosion. And Aboriginal people never forget the wildlife, never. They are of the same. They don't make that human other species distinction that as if we are somehow completely separate. They understand the interconnectedness. And this is Alinta Smart's Life Lifted into the Sky painting, the painting that she actually gave that name. And she says here when the atomic bomb went off, all the trees, grass, and animals were dead, left everything burnt, all went dry with no green bush and animal left, all gone. And similarly, Mima says, there was green grass and water and trees and birds singing in the trees. Then after the testing, a couple of weeks later, the branches of the trees were all dried up. The green grass is all turned into black. The water dried up or muddy and messy. The birds were gone. Wasn't much food there. People fell sick and were poisoned, as if all the people that lived on and worked on that land had been lifted up to the sky, and they were no longer there. And then Anne Marie Woods is talking about what she perceived as a forced migration. So although some Aboriginal people knew nothing about the tests at all until they happened and experienced them, there were some Aboriginal people living in missions near the site who were made to move. So we had no choice, the army told us. We must not be on our home soil as radiation had infected our soil. We were then forced to leave our home, escorted by the army in big green trucks to a new home. This was very hard for us and very sad for us, as all we knew and loved, our country, now it was gone. Okay, so Sue Coleman Hazeldine talked about that there were eventually some tests done on the 16,000 Australian service persons who were involved in these tests. Well, there were also 20,000 British servicemen involved in these tests, and both sets of service people believe they were used as guinea pigs and that they never got full acknowledgement of the harms that were done to them. So this is Evan Hudson, an Australian veteran, who was the first person to speak out among veterans really about the minor trials and about the harms that they had done to the environment. And he, again, has campaigned all his life since, being a young man involved in these tests for veterans in Australia. And this is a news broadcast about this on the occasion in 2012 when there was a British case going through the courts that was unsuccessful.
52 years after first serving the Australian Air Force at Maralinga, Avon Hudson still grapples with the fallout every day.
And it's not all physical illness, it's mental torment as well. And that never goes away.
Mr Hudson has long campaigned for the Australians affected by the British nuclear tests to be compensated. Successive governments here, though, have ignored the call, so a court case in England loomed as perhaps the final chance. 1,000 British veterans mounted a class action against the UK Ministry of Defence, claiming their exposure to radiation in the Australian outback led to illness, disability and in some cases death. Overnight, the Supreme Court in London rejected the claim.
Okay, so now in that account, Avon was talking about the psychological stress. I think it's hard for some of us to understand the extent of psychological impact participating in those tests had. And this short extract from this documentary with British veterans just gives you a little bit more of a sense of what it was like for them to be there, remembering they had no proper prior briefing. They didn't really know what they were going to be experiencing. And often they had completely inadequate protective equipment. And they were near enough the tests to experience, to feel the blast.
it was just sheer brilliant light. So I've never seen anything like it, never had done.
In the process of hands over your eyes, you saw every bone in your hand.
If I was looking at you now, I would see all your bones. You would see all the blood vessels and everything, the bones a lot.
Then the heat hit you, and that was just as if somebody my size had actually caught fire, then walked through me. It was an experience that was absolutely unearthly. It was so strange.
Some of the lads would stand up, but about 30 odd seconds later, you'd get the blast, and the blast would knock you flying.
And there were guys with bruises and broken limbs. We couldn't believe it.
Okay, so they go on and talk about the lifelong effect that had on them, and their own cancers, and the number of colleagues that they've lost to premature death, and the impact on their families, either because they were infertile and unable to have children, or because they had children who had developed serious genetic abnormalities. And this last man who's speaking talks about his daughter dying in his arms, having developed genetic abnormalities. So they're very harrowing accounts. But there's been long-term resistance to acknowledging this harm. So eventually, in 2017, the Australian government did issue what they called a gold health card, which would cover the healthcare costs of surviving participants of the British nuclear test programme. And Yami Lester, in the last year of his life, not long before his own death, said, 60 years too late. And British veterans today still want an apology and end-of-life care. And you might have seen press accounts today of the government announcing that they are having a year of commemoration, that they're going to have oral history projects to chronicle the experiences of veterans. Those who supported the UK's effort to develop a nuclear deterrent and to support, and a charity is going to be, charitable bids can be put in to support activities of nuclear test veterans and educate the public on the United Kingdom's nuclear deterrence efforts. The official statement, however, remains on record that the government do not accept in general that those present at nuclear test sites were exposed to harmful levels of ionizing radiation. That is there in Hansard and has not been removed, and the denial still continues. So the last voice you're going to hear is of Mia Hazeldine, the granddaughter of Sue Coleman Hazeldine. Now, this is a very harrowing testimony, and I almost apologize for playing it, but I think it is extremely important to hear it.
For that awesome intro. So my name is Mia Hazeldine. I'm a 29-year-old Googler woman from Ceduna. I'm the granddaughter of Sue, and everybody knows Nana Sue. She does so many campaigning, and she's done it since I was a little girl. I was attending meetings with her, and when I was a little girl attending, I never thought that I would be up here following in her footsteps, and that I would have a personal story that links to this nuclear disaster. But here I am. So I've been born into this family who have had to fight. We've had to fight for so many things regarding our livelihood, regarding our Aboriginal culture. And an activist is not something that I thought I would ever have to call myself. When I was 16 years old leaving school, I just thought I would go be a nurse, be a midwife. That was my goal. And instead of having a career that I wanted, or having, a home, a husband, or a simple, quiet, humble life, I am a single mum. I carry post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD. the PTSD I carry is caused from a genetic complication that meant my daughter developed tuber-shaped growths and tumours in her kidneys, her heart, and her brain, all whilst she was in utero. She was still in my stomach growing. There's no external factors that contributed to it, which means it was genetic, which means that our DNA has been mutated. Everything Nana fought for when I was a little girl, I had no idea it was going to lead to this. And she knew, she had a feeling, and it was right. And so now I'm here. There's not a day where I do not wonder how my life would be if she was still here with me. And I'm so glad and humbled that I can be here, a part of ICAN. And so today we're talking about prohibiting these nuclear weapons so that this can't keep happening. So I call on our Australian government and other countries, other governments, councils around Australia, I call on you all to prohibit the destruction and the trauma that these weapons leave behind. Not just for the people who were on the site or in close proximity, but to anyone who's been around a nuclear incident, because the bombings that happen here in Australia, they're not the only nuclear incidents, there are many. So educate yourselves, the information is out there. For all the following generations and all the unborn children, Australia needs to move, and so do other countries. We shouldn't have to fear another nuclear weapon being used on a country. I don't want another woman, another brother, another sister, another man, another family to experience the loss and the wonder or the doubt that did I lose my daughter because it is from fallout, or is it just something that happened? Like, I shouldn't have to doubt that. I feel like our Australian government should be contributing to research. They should be committing to understanding if there is genetic impacts on our people here in Australia. I don't know where to go with what I'm talking about. I wonder if my sisters or my sons, when they grow up, if they have children, is there going to be more of our babies that are born with tumours, and are they going to have to suffer the grief that, that is felt that I carry? My daughter would be 4 years old right now. And it has affected me immensely. It's affected my children and my family. We've all been affected by her loss. And I wonder if there are more stories out there like mine that they don't know that it could be from DNA.
Okay, so we do have a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Not that our government, of course, is a signatory, but it recognises the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons on Indigenous communities, on women and girls, and on those communities that have been affected by nuclear testing. And it requires the state parties who do sign it to give assistance to victims of all nuclear weapons use, including testing, and to make environmental remediation in places where weapons have been used, including testing.